associated with the Civil War that participated in the Black Hawk War and were, if not in Dubuque, definitely in Galena and up around the Dodgeville area along the Wisconsin River. They included a young man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. It included General Winfield Scott, Albert Sidney Johnson. I mentioned Jefferson Davis. It also included Zachary Taylor. So each one of these men played a very important role in early, but as well as Civil War history in the United States as well as around the Dubuque land area. Slavery was also an important part of Dubuque, our history and our culture. Although Dubuque in Iowa was created as a free territory and has always remained a free state, there were slaves actually living in Dubuque, in Galena, and over in Grant County, Wisconsin, once upon a time. When Dubuque and this whole area was part of the Michigan Territory, when some of the very first settlers came to this area, Henry Dodge, George Wallace Jones, the Quigley brothers, the Langworthy brothers, and others, Jones and Dodge brought slaves along with them. And there's also an 1840 census in Dubuque that listed George Jones's household, in which he had 3 slaves living with him. They were documented as slaves living in Dubuque, Iowa, which was a free state. So slavery definitely existed in the area. Iowa was settled primarily by migrants from out of state, primarily English-born or Eastern-born Englishmen or folks of English descent who were oftentimes very friendly with the South. Many of them were what you would categorize as Southern Democrats that came and really helped start and create Iowa. It was a whole part of the whole national movement of the Democrats at the time that consisted of President Andrew Jackson all the way down through people like John C. Calhoun and George Wallace Jones and Henry Dodge and their extended families. So early on, as the Michigan Territory got turned into the Wisconsin Territory and the Wisconsin Territory had the Iowa Territory carved out of it, slavery was a component and a discussion all throughout Dubuque's history, as it was the United States history. Everybody knew at the signing of the Constitution that slavery was still an unanswered question that was going to have to eventually be addressed and paid for, and probably paid for in blood for future generation of Americans, and so it came to be. 2 very interesting Supreme Court cases related to slavery in United States history. One was an Iowa Supreme Court case that occurred in 1838 related to a slave from Missouri by the name of Ralph. Ralph was brought to Dubuque by his master and lived and worked here in Dubuque as a squatter on some of his master's property for a year or 2 when some abolitionists that were moving into the territory convinced him that because of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which said no state or territory coming out of the Northwest Territory will be a slave state, all men living there will be considered free, convinced Ralph to sue for his freedom. And the Supreme Court heard the case in Iowa, at the time sitting in Burlington, and they actually sided in favor of Ralph and said Ralph indeed was a free man because he lived long enough in a free state. He was considered a citizen of that, or a resident of that state. Therefore, because of the Northwest Ordinance, as well as the Constitution of the Territory of Iowa, Ralph indeed was a free man. And so Ralph was let go and was a free man and ended up living in the Dubuque area for a while and moved back down to Missouri. Well, another slave living in Iowa briefly was a slave by the name of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was brought to Camp Armstrong in Rock Island by his master, who was a physician in the United States Army by the name of Emerson. And Emerson also owned some land in Davenport, which he had Dred Scott squat on. A squatter is basically someone who lives on a piece of property long enough until that piece of property then becomes their personal property through an agreement with the United States government. Generally, it's public lands that are given away. And because Dred Scott squatted on that property down around 3rd Street in Davenport, Iowa, he was also convinced by abolitionists that he had the right to be a free man. And so he sued for his own freedom. He sued in U.S. Supreme Court, in which the Dred Scott decision of 1857 was handed down by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who said that being a slave means that he is not a United States citizen, and if he is not a United States citizen, he therefore does not have the right to sue in United States court and does not have any constitutional rights. And therefore, Dred Scott decision was basically a decision that stipulated that slaves had no rights granted by the Constitution because they were not United States citizens. And that was in 1857 when that Supreme Court justice decision came down. The ironic part was that in 1856, Dred Scott was actually given his freedom or bought his freedom from his master and ended up dying a free man in 1859, even though the Dred Scott decision a year before came out said he indeed was not a free man because he had no constitutional rights. Besides Dred Scott and Ralph, the Dubuque land area, and it really was Grant County, Wisconsin, had an area known as Pleasant Ridge. Pleasant Ridge was about 5 miles west of Lancaster, Wisconsin, where B-Town is located today. And Pleasant Ridge was settled by a former slave who was granted his freedom upon his master's death. The slave, along with his brother, moved up to Grant County along with the master's son who wanted to get into lead mining. So he brought the 2 freed slaves with him, bought a tract of land, and they started working that land. Eventually, the 2 slaves made enough money that they started their own, or bought their own property, about 60 acres, and started their own little community. And word got around that Grant County was friendly to freed slaves. So slaves started to show up in Grant County from Missouri, from Tennessee, and from Arkansas, until a population of about 100 free slaves existed in the Pleasant Ridge area. And eventually in 1863, when blacks were allowed to fight for the Union in the Civil War, 2 of the original founders of Pleasant Ridge, Charles Shepard and his son John, both went to Prairie du Chien and immediately enlisted in the Union armies and went off to fight for the Union in the Civil War. Charles, the original founder of Pleasant Ridge, was killed at the Battle of Vicksburg. His son John eventually contracted a disease in the military and on his way home to Grant County, Wisconsin, passed away of the disease. And shortly thereafter, Pleasant Ridge started to basically fall apart. There were no jobs for a lot of the freed slaves because they didn't own any land, and there weren't large plantations for them to go to work on. Most farms locally were family farms and manned by families and not necessarily hired workers. So a lot of the former freed slaves ended up moving out of the area because of economic reasons. And over time, white hostilities as the Civil War started to approach also started creating some tensions that by the 1870s, many of the blacks did not feel comfortable living there any longer and decided to leave the area. So slavery was a very dominant part of our life, our culture, and daily politics and discussions in Dubuque and the Dubuque land area. But it was also part of a national conversation that Dubuque was very much heavily engaged in, really from the Civil War all the way to probably Teddy Roosevelt's second term. Dubuque had national voices on the national stage that impacted national policies, starting with the Civil War. First off, we have Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, as we know, was stationed at Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien. He actually married Zachary Taylor's daughter. Jones was college roommates, or Davis was college roommates of George Wallace Jones. I was founding father and first United States Senator. They attended Transylvania University at Lexington, Kentucky together and were college roommates. After they graduated in 1826, I think it was, Jeff Davis went on to West Point, and Jones ended up going on to Missouri, got a law degree, and then moved to Sincinawa Mound, Michigan Territory in 1828. At that time, Jones purchased Sincinawa Mound, built a cabin there. During the Black Hawk War, there was a battle. The Battle of Sincinawa Mound occurred there, in which several people were killed. There's still a plaque and an original garrison there that Jones had built, and it is on display for people to see. George Jones is a very interesting man. His father was allegedly friends of Benjamin Franklin, who was educated in Cambridge, England, came to the United States, helped draft the constitutions and the state codes for the creation of the states of Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. And his son, George Wallace Jones, ended up being a United States congressman for the territory of Michigan, Wisconsin, and eventually Iowa. Also created the territories of Wisconsin and Iowa, gave them their names, and eventually was Iowa's very first United States Senator when he was able to get the Iowa State Bill passed in 1846. Just a little interesting story of Jefferson Davis. When he was in the Black Hawk War, after Chief Black Hawk was captured, it was Davis's responsibility to take him down the Mississippi River to Galena, and then to take him via train to Chicago and on to Washington, D.C. for trial. As he was going down the Mississippi River, they were passing the bluffs of Dubuque, at which time Chief Black Sparrowhawk, which was his actual name, had mentioned to Lieutenant Davis that the bluffs of Dubuque used to be occupied by Julian Dubuque, a white man, and one of the only white men who ever honored and respected their pacts and their contracts with the Meskwaki Nation, which was an interesting little side note. Jones, being a senator, I mentioned, had convinced Senator Stephen A. Douglas to extend the land grant to the Illinois Central Railroad from Galena to Dubuque. When Douglas did that, that created a great amount of upheaval and consternation among citizens of Galena as well as Illinois, because they wanted the terminus to be in Galena, because wherever the terminus was, that city was going to grow in economy and population, and by having the railroad bypass Galena and end in Dubuque, it stagnated the growth and the potential of Galena, which the citizens recognized immediately. They held that against Stephen A. Douglas in the election of 1858, when Douglas ran against Abraham Lincoln for United States Senator, which resulted in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Jones and Douglas would argue for several years from 58 to 61 about the land grant and whose fault it was, and Douglas eventually said that he was duped by Jones to extend the railroad, and Jones said Douglas did it of his own free will. Although they were both Southern Democrats, they did not get along towards the end of their Senate careers. As we know, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln had their famous Lincoln-Douglas debates around Illinois. They had one in Freeport, Illinois. The night before that debate in Freeport, Stephen Douglas actually stayed at the DeSoto House Hotel in Galena, Illinois, which still stands today. It's one of the Midwest oldest hotels, and when it was originally built, was the largest hotel in the Midwest. So Douglas stayed at the DeSoto House. Abraham Lincoln also stayed a couple times at the DeSoto House when he'd be in Galena, handling cases for the Illinois Railroad or other railroads. Upon one occasion, he came in 1859 to Dubuque and spoke at the Julian House, now the Julian Inn, to a group of young Republicans. He was staying in Galena and took a day trip over to Dubuque to give the speech. At that speech was a young Dubuque man by the name of William Boyd Allison. William Boyd Allison was a protege of Samuel Kirkwood. Samuel Kirkwood was an Ohio immigrant to Iowa and was the governor of Iowa during the Civil War. He's known as Iowa's war governor. Both William Boyd Allison and Samuel Kirkwood came from the same part, the same county of Ohio. They both were familiar and knew a young man by the name of John Sherman, who would go on to be a very powerful United States senator in the last half of the 19th century. John Sherman also happened to be the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman. And Samuel Kirkwood and William Boyd Allison and John Sherman all were protégés of Samuel P. Chase, the governor of Ohio, going into the Civil War. Samuel P. Chase would go on to be the Secretary of Treasurer under the Lincoln administration. All these men were connected, and what we really see here as you study Dubuque and Iowa history is really a shifting of the old guard, the Southern Democrats of the first part of the 19th century, those who had helped settle the Michigan, the Wisconsin, and the Iowa territories and helped turn Wisconsin and Iowa into states. They were starting to lose control and power, and you were seeing a sweeping movement from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana of abolitionist Republicans and former Whigs, people like Lincoln and Samuel Kirkwood and William Boyd Allison, who really became the next generation of Iowa and Dubuque politics. And this is really when Iowa and Dubuque kind of migrated from being strongly Democratic to strongly Republican. Now, Dubuque's always been a Democratic stronghold. Lincoln lost Dubuque County in the 1860 election, even though he won the state of Iowa in the election, because Dubuque has always maintained a very strong Democratic stronghold. But it was really William Boyd Allison and the next generation of Civil War soldiers that became the next generation of politicians and leaders, and were very influential in Dubuque and the surrounding areas. General George Wallace Jones was the first United States senator from Iowa up until 1858, in which time the Iowa State Legislature, which elected the state senators to the United States Senate, really migrated from being a Democratic body to a Republican body. And so the Republican body of the Iowa House elected James Grimes as the next United States Senator from Iowa. So basically, George Jones, who was running for re-election in 1858, lost the election to a Republican, James Grimes, who is the first Republican congressman from the state of Iowa. And so President Buchanan gave George Jones an ambassadorship to Bogota, New Granada. Today it is known as Bogota, Colombia. And Jones